Good evening. I'm Bill Goldstein. It's so nice to be able to start on time. Ben, there are no stragglers for this talk. Everyone wanted a seat right away, so congratulations. I'm Bill Goldstein, and I'm pleased to welcome you to Roosevelt House. I'm the programming curator here, and welcome you on behalf of Harold Holzer, the Jonathan F. Fanton director of Roosevelt House, and also Jennifer Rabb, the president of Hunter College. It is a great privilege to have our speakers with us tonight. Benjamin Hett, professor of history here at Hunter and also at the Graduate Center, who has conducted wonderful interviews for us at Roosevelt House and now returns on literally the other side of the dais. We had a discussion of which side he would be on since our moderator is usually on this side, so Ben wanted to be on that side, to present his new and justly acclaimed book, The Death of Democracy, Hitler's Rise to Power and the Downfall of the Weimar Republic. Working with Ben on those earlier programs led to a friendship that I value, and I know from our talks about this book and so much else that Ben is as brilliant at answering questions as he is at asking them, always clarifying complicated issues with his sharp intelligence and potent analytic skills. So I think we have a great, if sobering, treat in store for us as we hear more about the death of democracy. People are taking notice of Ben's book and its significance. The other day, Fareed Zakaria on his CNN program, GPS, chose Ben's book as his book of the week, saying, "People forget that Weimar Germany was probably the world's most advanced country. How we went from there to the Nazis is a fascinating story that Hett tells, and it does have real lessons for today about the elites who either assisted or were complacent as Hitler destroyed German democracy." And the Times of London praised the death of democracy as intelligent, well-informed, and intriguing. Hett provides a lesson about the fragility of democracy and the danger of that complacent belief that liberal institutions will always protect us. The Telegraph also called the book fascinating, readable, and well-researched. Ben has taught at Hunter since 2003, and you'll find more about his earlier prize-winning books and his career in academia and also as a lawyer in his biography in your programs. Ben is joined tonight by Charles Taylor, whose book, Opening Wednesday at a Theater or Drive-In Near You, The Shadow Cinema of the American 70s, was published last year. I think he is the recipient of one of the most memorable compliments I have ever heard. He is, according to the novelist Steve Erickson, movie criticism's Dostoevsky, who reveals a national identity forged from the innocence we claim to have lost but never had in the first place. Somewhat more mundanely, the Los Angeles Times simply praised the book as brilliant, a vivid and expansive cultural history, superbly argued. So Ben and Charles will talk for about 40 minutes, and then we will move to an audience Q&A. And afterwards, please join us upstairs in the Four Freedoms room for a reception and book signing. And you could continue the conversation with Ben and Charles and also purchase copies of The Death of Democracy. Thank you all for being here, and welcome, Charles and Ben.
So, Professor.
So, Charles.
This didn't make me feel any better. It's a terrific book. But it is a book that is going against very persistent, as you lay out, persistent myths about how Germany became a dictatorship. And reading it, I realized that in our minds we tend to think of this as just some sort of spell, something that happened. So I think, though, because you lay out your case here so carefully, that we should probably take a methodical approach to it. So I'm going to ask you first to outline what those myths are, the persistent myths about why Germany became a Nazi country.
Sure, okay. So there are probably two categories of those myths. There are myths that the Nazis themselves formulated as they took power and as they ruled. And then there are myths which historians have, to some extent, recirculated in the years since the Second World War. And actually, there are some interesting connections between these. So, among other things, the Nazis like to claim that what they were doing was retrieving German honor and German power, coming after what they saw as not just the defeat at the end of World War I in 1918, but as the Nazis put it, the stab in the back, by which the Nazis claimed their political opponents, principally Social Democrats, and of course, since they were Nazis, principally Jewish Social Democrats, had signed a shameful peace treaty with the Western Allies and delivered Germany over to defeat and surrender when the army could actually have won. This was a myth actually quite deliberately fostered by people who weren't Nazis, but who were military commanders and had an interest in people believing that the army was not to blame for the defeat. And the Nazis picked this up and recircled it. Then there's the, in some ways, more interesting, and in some ways, I think today, more insidious category of myths which have cropped up in the writing of history since the Second World War. And I mentioned that there is a connection between these. The connection is, we are only really now, I mean, so long after the Second World War, so many decades later, we are only now starting to realize the extent to which the writing of this history in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s even, was very much driven and shaped by people who had been Nazis, who were implicated in this story, who had things to hide, who had things to be ashamed about, who had things to worry that they might be convicted for something over. And many of these people were able to get to historians and influence the first generation or two of historians with their versions of what had happened that were self-exculpatory. And these have gone right into the history writing and have been sort of endlessly recircled. And historians now, it's really a process that started in maybe about the middle of the 1990s, that historians have started to unpack these a little bit. One example is, this is a slightly later period, that there's the idea of what is called the clean armed forces, this idea that in the Second World War, German soldiers fought a conventional patriotic war like anybody else and didn't commit any crimes. All the crimes were committed by Nazi organizations. We now know that's not true, that the German army, the regular army, committed massive war crimes, mostly in the Eastern Front, but also in other areas as well, and were just as implicated in crimes as specifically Nazi agents. More in my own kind of wheelhouse of research, and a direct element of this book, is the story of the event of the Reichstag fire, which is one of the principal events by which Hitler and the Nazis were able to consolidate their power.
And the subject of your previous book.
The subject of my previous book, yeah. Only 4 weeks after Hitler had come to power as chancellor, the German parliament suddenly went up in flames. The Nazis, pounced on this and said, it's the communists. This is the beginning of a communist coup d'etat against our administration. We need emergency powers to crack down. And they put thousands of people in jail, and they gutted the very democratic Weimar Constitution. Since World War II, a number of the police officers who investigated that crime, but who then not only did very sleazy things in that investigation, but went on to commit horrendous war crimes during the war, decided that it was a much better story if they could say there had been one sole perpetrator, a poor, crazy, mentally challenged Dutch guy who had wandered into the Reichstag. They said, no, he did it all. The Nazis were not implicated. The communists were not implicated. He did it by himself, and we tried to say that at the time. And we stood up bravely and told truth to power. Now, this is nonsense from beginning to end for complicated reasons that I won't thresh them all out here. But the important thing is it served the interest of these war criminals, and it was believed by historians, and it's still believed by some historians, shamefully in my opinion, but it is still believed by some historians in 2018. But it's a exculpatory war criminal fantasy from beginning to end. But it's become an important part of the story because it has a kind of broader implication. Because if you see the Nazis as being responsible for the fire, you're going to tend to see their path to power as being calculated and strategic. If you argue, as some historians have done, no, it just happened, it was this crazy Dutch guy himself who set fire to the Reichstag, the Nazis just kind of made it up as they went along, you have the effect of somewhat letting the Nazis off the hook, of to some extent saying they were less calculating, they were less focused ruthlessly on power, less violent. Hitler's just there and stuff happened. The historian who's had the most deleterious effect on this, who wrote an important book in the 1960s and who falsified the record significantly, a guy named Fritz Tobias, actually has an amazing line at the end of his book where he says something to the effect of, it was only the Reichstag fire that by pure chance converted the civilian Chancellor Hitler into the power-mad dictator, which is to say Hitler was not a power-mad guy until somebody else burned the parliament, which is A, absurd, and B, nasty in its political implications. It's interesting that when that book was translated into English, they cut that part right out. I think the translators thought this is not going to go down well in Britain and America. So it's in the German edition, but not the English. But that's just one of a number of examples of this kind of phenomenon.
But a lot of the effects of this is to make Nazism seem something almost supernatural, and and inevitable. And the book is very clear about what made this possible. It was not at all inevitable. And although you're reading this, and World War II is hovering, it's World War I that really haunts the book. And you said it's impossible to overstate the importance of World War I, considering what happened in Germany.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think this is a difficult thing for us to recover mentally in the year 2018, because we are so far from World War I. And in many ways, America was sort of farther from World War I than anyone in Europe was anyway. So I think it's difficult for us to imagine how that war loomed over Germany in the 20s and 30s. And of course, this sounds obvious, but in some ways it's not. World War II hadn't happened yet when the stuff I'm writing about here happened. And, it's so much a part of our mental furniture that it's hard to unthink it. But the people in this story don't know what's coming yet. But they've lived through World War I. And just to give you one little snapshot, I sometimes wheel this out for my students. Germany lost 1.7 million soldiers killed in the First World War out of a population of about, at that time, 65 million. That would be as if we had a war now in 2018 in the United States and had about 8 million soldiers killed. Now, just imagine what our politics would be like if we had a war and 8 million soldiers were killed and we lost on top of it, right? Like, I can't even get my mind around how that would be. And that's the background, that's some of the background that people here are coming out of. And then on top of that, there is a revolution and a regime change at the end of the war. There are catastrophic economic crises. There's sort of an ongoing low-grade civil war for a good part of the early 20s and then again in the early 30s. Of course, the Great Depression after 1929. I mean, Germans really got the works, between 1914 and 1933, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. And that, of course, that's what breeds Nazism. That's what breeds the whole political climate of this era.
Here's a quote from the book. In the years after the war, the question for Germany was whether they would accommodate themselves to the Western global order or rebel against it. And you go on to say that that decision very much determined the kind of government that Germany was going to have.
Yeah. So the point I make in the book, among the book's subtexts, I'll put this right out here, is the idea that the European Union is a pretty good thing. And one of the ways I sort of try to convey this in the book is, on this point, the people who were politically democratic in Germany in the 20s and 30s were also very much politically inclined towards European integration. And in fact, there were moves afoot, especially around 1930-31, to create something that would look a lot like today's European Union. And Germany's democratic politicians were quite enthusiastically for that. The anti-democratic nationalist politicians were most definitely not. They wanted a Germany really cut off from Europe and the world, not dependent on international trade, not dependent on international markets, not dependent on international finance, not dependent on imports of raw materials, cut off, autonomous, and therefore able to then project its power back at its European neighbors. And the correlation works just about perfectly. If you're for better relations with France and integration with Europe, you're probably a Democrat in Germany in that time. If you are not, if you are for, for instance, what's known as autarky, economic self-reliance, you are probably also a nationalist, you're probably an anti-democrat, you're probably well on your way to being a Nazi in some form or other.
We tend to think, again, speaking of the myths we have about Nazism, we tend to think of this as something as coming out of instability. The most surprising thing in the book to me was your point that it is in some ways actually a response to the stability of Weimar as a new democracy. And you make a number of points which I think are very important about, I guess, what we would call the liberalism of the Weimar Republic. So I ask you to just speak to that and enumerate some of those elements.
Yeah. This actually, and going back to your first question, this is also one of the myths which has endlessly recirculated in a lot of the historical literature, that Germany's first experiment in democracy is doomed from the get-go. It's just never going to work. It's doomed from 1918. That, in my respectful opinion, is also nonsense. And you can look at many signs of how German politics was going in the middle of the 1920s, and you can see, exactly as Charlie has been saying, you can see a real coalescing of sort of centrist support for democracy, for liberal politics, for all kinds of reforms in various social ways. And, you know, about the time I started reading this book, I read a really brilliant and fascinating book that was published about 7 or 8 years ago on American politics by a couple of political scientists called Winner-Take-All Politics. The basic argument of that book is, starting about the 1970s, big business started realizing it was really getting, as it saw it, shafted by a lot of reform legislation, and so big business started organizing more sophisticated lobbying efforts and working particularly with the Republican Party to start pushing back against the reforms of the Johnson era and before. And this sort of leads us to the political environment that we've seen in the last 40 years. And it occurred to me, this is exactly what happened in Weimar. It happened a little faster, but it's the same process. You know, about 1926, 27, 28, German big business is looking around and they see what's happened in this new republic, and they see, well, okay, the government has created labor laws which strengthen greatly the role of organized labor and unions. Worker representation in factories is a big thing. There was a national wage arbitration system whereby companies of a certain size, their wage settlements with workers would be arbitrated by a national government wage arbitration board. Businesses are starting to feel that this is really a problem because it's driving wages up and it's really cutting into profits. There's a lot more regulation of business than there had been pre-World War I. Business is not usually ever too excited about that. And at the same time, there are people in the armed forces. Germany's armed forces was limited by the Treaty of Versailles to a small size by the standards of the time, but the commanders of the armed forces were always sort of working covertly to find ways to build it up. And among the things that drove the military commanders crazy was that the elected parliament, which was dominated by the Social Democrats, left of center party, and then around the Social Democrats, a coalition of mostly moderate centrist democratic parties, that they just kept refusing to vote for military appropriations. And the sort of biggest symbol of this was at the end of the 20s when the Social Democrats and their political allies voted down funding for a new battleship. And at this point, the military commander said, you know, this has got to stop. And they started thinking, we need to get the Social Democrats out of power so we can get military appropriations. That means we need to shut down the democracy. And they started thinking very hard about how they can do that. And this sort of sets up the conditions for all the horrific things that happen. But it is, I think it's important to stress, it is rooted there. It's rooted in the mid-20s. It's rooted in the success of democracy. And even economically, by the middle of the 20s, Germany was actually starting to recover from the economic chaos of the immediate post-World War I era. By 1927, if you look at the economic statistics, most of the indicators are getting back to 1913 levels. Things are starting to go pretty okay. It's actually remarkably like Germany in the 50s, or West Germany in the 50s. You see the same process. West Germany in the 50s, little by little coming out of the war, democracy starts to consolidate, the economy gets better, it starts to kind of take, it starts to gel. And that's happening in Germany until the late 20s, and then it gets sandbagged. And it's that process of, you know, powerful interests reacting to the success of the stabilization of democracy that sets up the chapter that leads to Hitler.
How much do you think, I'm going to ask you to step outside historian and be a cultural commentator, how much do you think this myth that persists of, you know, the doomed democracy has to do with the image that culture is presented of Weimar, you know, the decadent image you get in Isherwood and then...
Yeah. Well, you know, I would be willing to bet that a large share, if not a complete share of folks in this audience are very familiar with some of the great cultural products of that era, the amazing painters, the amazing writers, the music of Kurt Weill and Bertolt Brecht. I mean, you know, we all still, I certainly still love that stuff. You know, when there's, a few years ago at the MoMA, there was an exhibit of painters from Berlin in that era, and people flocked to it. I mean, it's still a big deal. And that tends to be our image of Germany from that time. You got to remember, that's a very Berlin image. It's a big city image, but it's very particularly a Berlin image. And most Germans didn't live in Berlin. You know, most Germans are out in smaller towns, smaller cities, or they're in the countryside. And if you're in the countryside, you are quite likely to not like Berlin very much. You're quite likely to not like, the sort of classic paintings of Weimar showing, prostitutes in a sleazy Berlin club in some state of, undress. You're not likely to like the paintings of people like Otto Dix showing, soldiers from the war in a kind of less than heroic mold. You're not likely to like the music of Kurt Weill and Bertolt Brecht, which draws on American jazz and African American influences. You're likely to see all of this as cultural degeneration. You're likely to see it as Jewish influence. You're likely to see it as maybe even immigrant influence. And so there's a bitter culture war going on. It's to some extent an urban-rural culture war. It's to some extent a right-left culture war. There's a bitter culture war going on, which feeds right into the politics. It feeds right into the thing we were just talking about the reaction against the democratization.
One of our favorite writers just died a few weeks ago, Philip Kerr, who has written an amazing series of detective novels about a cop, a character named Bernie Gunther, who starts as a cop in Weimar and then spends the next 15 years running from the monsters of the 20th century. And there's a line in one of the novels, even Germans don't like Berliners, and it's a feeling that's usually reciprocated.
Yeah.
So there really is a sense that this resentment of learning, of sophistication, of culture, and also one of the things that you mentioned in the book is Jewish refugees are a real target of that.
Yeah. Yeah, so, as I was working on this book, the more I worked on it, the more I started thinking, my goodness, a lot of this sounds awfully familiar, from more recent things. Yes, there was a refugee, so to speak, a refugee crisis in the Germany of the 20s and early 30s, particularly the 20s, largely unleashed by the effects of the First World War, which, of course, as the war ended, four big empires that had dominated Central Europe and the Near East collapsed: Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And in all the turbulence of this, not totally unlike our century, a lot of people were dislocated and fled in various directions, including west. And in particular, a lot of Jewish people fled out of what had been the Russian Empire and into Germany, because Germany, it's one of history's tragic ironies. Germany was a pretty good place to be Jewish anytime before 1933, relative to the world. I mean, relative to a world where, pretty much everywhere there was anti-Semitism. In Germany, Jews had legal equality. They had very good career opportunities. If you look at Germany prior to 1933, what you see is a real record of, quite remarkable success on the part of the German Jewish community. And then the refugees start coming in, and the refugees are quite different. I mean, the refugees look different. They speak a different language. They often practice religion differently. They are just visibly foreign in every way. And this really starts, upsetting the apple cart. And, lots of Germans who are not Jewish look at these incomers. They have a word for it. They're called the Eastern Jews, the Ostjuden. And they really stir up a sort of deeper, more visceral kind of anti-Semitism. But even assimilated German Jews are not altogether happy about the migrants coming in. So there's a big problem with this. The border, they're coming across the new border with Poland. Poland's a new country at that time. And so there's a lot of rhetoric about border security. There's a lot of rhetoric about the fact that Germany can't control its eastern border. It doesn't have the manpower, police or military manpower. And this becomes really a political football again between the right and the left, because the eastern border with Poland is basically the border of the state of Prussia, Germany's biggest state, which is in this whole period controlled by a sort of center-left state government. And so the national government, which is often enough in the hands of the center-right, accuses the center-left administration in Prussia, saying, you're soft on the border, you're lax on the border, you're not doing anything. And what the national government wants to do actually is round up militias, including the Nazis' militia, to guard the border. And the Prussian government is incredibly unexcited about this, because if you have Nazi stormtroopers guarding the border, this means the national government is basically arming the most bitter and determined and in some ways effective opponents of the democracy in Prussia to be sort of stationed there. It's this kind of constant looming threat. And so this is a sort of running theme through all the politics of this era.
Okay, so some of the groups who've made this possible so far that you've outlined, we have big business, the military, Hicks, and conservative politicians.
Yeah.
And that is sort of, in the book emerges, kind of the final line of defense, the role that conservative politicians played in allowing Hitler to come to power.
Right. So as we get to about 1930, 31, 32, where the sort of crisis and climax of this story of the Nazi rise comes in, what's happening is from 1930 on, Hitler and his party are starting to get a lot of votes. They didn't until then. It was in the national election of 1930 that the Nazis really hit a breakthrough, and they sort of catapulted up to being the second biggest party in Germany's parliament. And at that point, Hitler overnight kind of becomes a political rock star. And all of a sudden, he's interesting to the mainstream right. Up until that point, the mainstream right looked at Hitler and kind of thought what most people thought when they looked at Hitler in that time. This guy never made it past the rank of private in 4 years in the Great War. That's unheard of. I mean, if you served 4 years in the Great War in any army, you would probably end up at least a captain. He never made it past private. By the way, one of my favorite Hitler stories, he was never promoted past private, as one of his officers testified after World War II. The officer said, "We thought he lacked the leadership qualities to be a sergeant." And it's even funnier because what he said in German, leadership qualities, he said Führer qualities. We thought he lacked the Führer qualities to be a sergeant. In the Nuremberg courtroom when he said this, everybody laughed too. But so now Hitler has a big voting bloc behind him, and suddenly he's interesting to the mainstream right. The mainstream right's big problem is their agenda, as we outlined previously, basically big business friendly, military friendly. There are real limits on the electoral support that they can get. And it hovers around, by the early 30s, it hovers around 8 to 10% of people are going to vote, for that kind of agenda. So they're not going to get anywhere with that. All of a sudden, they start looking at Hitler, and they start thinking, okay, he's kind of crude. He doesn't even speak grammatical German. Never made it past private. He's vulgar. He's got these thuggish stormtroopers running around. But, his following is national. They're nationalist. They're pro-military. They're anti-socialist, which is good. They're anti-communist, which is good. They also say there's a wing of the Nazi Party which, from a big business standpoint, says disturbing sort of anti-capitalist and anti-elite things as well. But the mainstream conservatives sort of think maybe that'll go away. At least he's anti-communist, they're nationalist, they're militarist. This is useful. We can use this. So they start trying to figure out a way to get this following behind them. And there's always this uneasy relationship between the leaders of the mainstream kind of center-right conservative parties, elite establishment conservative parties, and Hitler and his following. It's always this awkward relationship. The people leading the mainstream parties are kind of gentlemen in the traditional sense. They're well off, they're aristocrats, they're upper middle class, they're well educated. They were usually officers during the war. And they assume, well, this vulgar little upstart, he's not very smart. We can control him, of course. We can use him and control him. And this is the dynamic that sets in. They're trying to figure out how to do this, how to use him and control him. And of course, you know how the story ends. Hitler turns out to be a lot smarter and a lot more uncontrollable than they had thought. But they could not imagine this. They could not imagine being outwitted by this vulgar, ungrammatically speaking little upstart.
I want to ask you a question. It might be a little involved, and I want you to bear with me. Last week in the Times, Madeleine Albright, our former Secretary of State, wrote an editorial which she basically linked the rise of Trump to the renewed success of fascism in the world. And it was remarkable. It was bracing to read that, and in an odd way cheering, because here's someone who is sober, serious person, not at all on a fringe, speaking bluntly about what we're seeing and not mincing her words. You've written what I think is a book that is a clear and reasoned explanation of the rise of the irrational, which is perhaps a contradiction. But you never deny the irrationality of the Nazis. You never, though, write as if it was an inevitable thing. And at the end, you say that Germans cannot be blamed for not foreseeing the unthinkable, for not foreseeing crimes that had no precedent. and you say, we who come later have one advantage over them. We have their examples before us. When I read that, I thought, well, who will pay attention? Because no matter what examples history gives us, the impulse of rational people, reasoned people, is to deny the irrational and the appeal of the irrational. And to think that, well, this is, if we sit here, we can listen to the parallels you're making, but there's also a temptation to sit here and say, well, it's not as bad as that. It's not, it's an unfair comparison. So I'd just like you to speak to that. Because to me, it's, we have the dystopias. We have the fiction dystopias. We had, Sinclair Lewis wrote, It Can't Happen Here, and Roth wrote The Plot Against America. Yep. This is the first non-fiction dystopia that I.
Yeah, okay, well, yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple things in there. First, the irrationality of the Nazis. Yes, this is very important. This is also one of these things which may set off an echo or two in 2018. Hitler very expressly said that his whole pitch was based upon lying, on dishonesty. He said, you only get anywhere in politics if you tell big lies. Don't tell little lies, tell big lies. Secondly, is related, slightly distinct, but related to that, is the ways in which the Nazis' program was not aimed at the mind of anybody. It was aimed at the gut. And there's a great example I quote in the book. There's a guy named Peter Drucker, who's probably familiar to a number of you, became famous after World War II as a writer on business management. But in his kind of earlier incarnation in the 1930s, he was a journalist in Germany. He came originally from Austria. And he wrote a really smart, perceptive book, which I think has been largely forgotten, but it's worth reading. He wrote a really smart book published about 38, 39, when these events are still kind of hot in his memory. And he described watching a Nazi politician give a speech. And the politician made the following pitch. He said, we don't want higher bread prices. We don't want lower bread prices. We don't want bread prices to remain the same. We want National Socialist bread prices. And Drucker, I think, very intelligently glosses this by saying, look, I mean, this is because all of the policies that seem rational have failed. The only thing left is some sort of fantasy that somehow might work if you just will it to work. And in any case, the politician is sort of getting at the anger that a lot of people felt. And Germans had some legit reasons to be angry about how the world was treating them in this era. And certainly a lot of Germans were suffering from the effects of what the global economy was doing to them, especially farmers and people in rural areas at that time. There were legit grievances. And this irrationality kind of like captures those legit grievances and channels them in a way which is, of course, not going to be productive in terms of actually solving problems, but it's going to resonate with voters. I'm sorry, there was a second part to your question that I meant to answer and it sort of escaped me.
How do we, acknowledge this, I suppose, without escaping the charge of your being alarmist?
Yeah, okay. So, look, undeniably the same things are happening. Undeniably, I'll come right out and say it. Undeniably, Donald Trump could not have succeeded without a fair degree of irrationality in both his pitch and in the way it was received by people who voted for him. He could not have succeeded, without a good deal of dishonesty. Actually, something else that Drucker says about Hitler and the Nazis I think is quite germane here. Drucker makes, again, one of his very alert, intelligent points when he says, look, obviously rationality wouldn't fix this problem of the rise of the Nazis because the Nazis rose to success in a climate where they had governments that were against them and were sort of speaking against them. They had a media that was largely against them and speaking against them, and people pointed out what was wrong with these guys, and still they got a lot of votes. And this may not sound altogether unfamiliar to people living in 2018. So there is a worry that, rational argument cannot reach or convince everybody. I would probably start digging a hole in the ground or move to France or something if I didn't have a faith that ultimately in this country the numbers of people who will permanently be reached by irrational and hateful election pitches will not be a permanent majority, or even a large enough plurality to keep politicians who use them in office. And I hope that we will return to sanity. We've seen this happen many times before. America has its periodic outbreaks of nuttiness, McCarthyism, and so on, and we always recover. And I would certainly like to believe, and I do believe actually, that we will recover. But I must say, as a historian of Germany, which probably makes me a professional pessimist, I do think we have things to worry about. There are things that are concerning in what is happening in our politics, and certainly not just in our politics, around the world. I mean, I'm sure everybody in this room kind of knows the examples. We just saw this past weekend the election in Hungary, which returned with a solid majority of Viktor Orban to power, and he's a pretty nasty specimen as well, and on and on and on. Russia, Turkey, the Philippines.
Last question, then we're going to open it up to the audience. But obviously, as a historian, your dedication is to the facts. I'm wondering if you can speak the experience of writing this, because from the title on down, The Death of Democracy, the language in this seemed very blunt to me, often very blunt. And what I was thinking of when I was reading it is, you and I have talked about this, the part that language played in allowing Hitler to come to power. When you read Victor Klemperer's diaries, what you're reading is the derangement of daily life bit by bit. When you read Friedrich Reich, and the disgust that pours out of that, and the contempt he was seeing for plain facts, for truth.
Yeah.
What's I understand the experience of the historian, and I think, as you said, probably the excitement of the historian when new viewpoints are opening up in a subject that's been mined for a while. What was your experience as a writer writing this?
Yeah, well, so some of what's in this book is the product of research that I've done, which I think puts some new facts on the table. And this may sound surprising to you, but even in a story like this, which goodness knows I am a good long way from the first to have written an account of this particular story. There have been any number of brilliant historians who have worked over this ground. But there are new things to say. There are new things to find. And as a professional history geek, one of the things I love the most is going into an archive full of really dusty, old, crumbling paper and knowing I may come out of this finding some fact that no living person knows. And there are a few elements of this book that do reflect that. On the broader point, I sometimes feel being a historian is a careful and patient and hopeful and often frustrating task, because we should, as historians, be dedicated to a sort of classically Enlightenment, rationalist, this is the evidence, these are the conclusions you can draw from it, where do we go with this? It sometimes frustrates me that it's not just many regular citizens in their voting capacity, but often enough professional historians who do not, I think, pay enough attention to that kind of thing. Let me give you one example. I was at a conference in Germany about a year and a half ago, and a very distinguished senior German historian came up to me. He was very friendly. He was grinning, kind of clapped me on the back. And he was talking about the book I had written about the Reichstag fire, the basic findings of which are in this book as well. And he said to me, grinning broadly, he says, I haven't bothered to read your book because I already know it's wrong. Honest to God, he said this. And I thought, I wasn't about to tell this senior distinguished guy to go to hell, although that's kind of what passed into my mind. But, I thought it's extraordinary to me that he would admit that. It's extraordinary to me that abdication of what I think the duty that we should be doing as scholars, to ourselves, to our profession, to our readers. I think all you can do is keep trying to roll the rock up the hill, trying to uncover the evidence and follow it honestly and see where it leads.
With that, I think we have some questions.
given the fact that Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution allowed for the appointment of a dictator, should we be surprised that democracy didn't last?
I'm sorry. Oh, there you are. Okay. That's a great question. Let me answer that sort of coming out of my experience as a former lawyer. I think one thing that most lawyers learn pretty quickly is that a legal text has a virtually infinite range of meanings. No law is self-enforcing and no law is self-interpreting. And any given constitutional framework allows a remarkable range of political outcomes. And so I actually don't think that the presence of Article 48, this is, for those who may not be too familiar with this is the provision of the German Constitution that allowed the President of the Republic to govern by way of what we would call executive orders, basically in anything he deemed to be an emergency. And it was the provision, it contributed greatly to Hitler coming to power because it made possible a kind of move away from democracy. But it didn't necessarily need to if the political culture had been different. And I think that's the key thing. A political culture that's different, that's more activist, more determined to keep to the rails of democratic practice, for instance, will keep that from happening. Many years ago, when I was a law student in Canada, one of my professors commented on the Canadian Constitution. I'm sure you're all deeply familiar with the Canadian Constitution. But the Canadian Constitution, which was actually originally a British statute of 1867, my professor said, if you actually read it without knowing anything about what happens in Canada, you would have to conclude Canada is a dictatorship run by somebody called the Governor General. Now, in fact, Canada is a perfectly viable parliamentary democracy run by a prime minister. There is a Governor General who has no power. But you wouldn't know that from the Constitution, and that's kind of the thing. I mean, laws may give you some guidance or path, but in my view, there are sort of more decisive things that happen.
Is there a gentleman right here?
Examining Hitler's rise to power and his effort to make Germany great again, there are far too many parallels to what's going on today. But there's one significant difference, and I'm wondering how significant you deem that to be in the analysis, and that is we're an over 200-year-old democracy, and they were a 1.5-decade-old democracy.
Yep.
How relevant is that?
It's highly relevant. It's highly relevant. And I think kind of going back to what I just said a moment ago, part of what gives me faith that we won't go all the way down the road to Nazi Germany is the political culture of this country, which of course is a very old development as a democracy. And I do think that at the end of the day, there are enough people out there, there are enough Americans who are going to say, go to hell, I'm not having a dictator. That there will be some pushback against that. I was actually quite inspired by something I heard on the radio maybe a couple of years ago about these people in areas of the Southwest, I think, where there are, I'm not sure exactly what they're called, but sort of border cops. I guess they would be ICE agents now, who sort of prowl around looking for people that might be illegal immigrants. And there's a bunch of people in some of the southwestern border states who sort of make a point of running into them so they can kind of heckle them. And they'd film themselves or tape themselves. There was like a Protestant minister of some kind who's sort of really messing with the ICE agent, and who asks him, does he have papers showing he's a citizen? And the pastor says, well, that's the wrong question. You should be asking me, am I saved? Do you want me to talk to you about that? And, I mean, maybe it's a bit of a trivial example, but I think it gets to something important, that there is a culture here, there is a deep culture of democracy in the United States, which however much we may periodically go crazy, I do think will keep us okay, although you don't want to necessarily totally bank on it. I mean, democracy requires vigilance, folks, it's not self-activating, it needs us to be involved. The other thing, by the way, is the federal system. I think the federal system is the other thing I have some faith and optimism regarding. It was actually key, I talk about this a little bit in the book, that the Nazis, actually their sort of immediate predecessors, a relatively right-wing national government did the Nazis a big favor by getting rid of the center-left government of the state of Prussia, which was hugely important in Germany. And that made it a lot easier then for the Nazis to consolidate power over the federal states of Germany as well as at the level of the national government.
Gentleman over by the wall. Will you just wait for the microphone, sir? Thank you.
Hi, Ben.
Hi, John.
In your comments about the ability of Hitler to overcome a lot of obstacles within Germany and within German institutions, you mentioned that the media was actually against him. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the media in Germany at that time and how it worked against him and how Hitler managed to use it, it would seem, on his behalf.
Yeah, that's a good question. Certainly not all of the media was against him. Probably most of it was any time before 1933. The German media landscape of the 20s and early 30s was kind of like everything else in Germany in that period. It was a period of really amazing creativity in newspapers as well. There were a number of really great newspapers in Germany in that era. There's probably three that really stand out. There was two of them were Berlin papers. One was Frankfurt. There was the Vossische Zeitung, or Voss's News, you would call it, in Berlin, and the Berliner Tageblatt, which is sort of the Berlin Daily News in Berlin, and then a famous paper, the Frankfurter Zeitung, which is the ancestor of today's Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, is still one of the big papers in Germany. And these were papers that were really sophisticated, really literate. They had some great reporters. Some of the great writers of the time wrote for these papers. And they were generally, those three papers that I just named were sort of moderate liberal papers, and they were ferociously critical of the Nazis. There was certainly a right-wing media, and one of the big factors involved, there's a kind of Rupert Murdoch of Weimar Germany, a guy named Alfred Hugenberg, who had originally been a big manager of the huge Krupp's steel company, and then he went into media during World War I, and in the 20s he had an enormous media empire comprising newspapers and also the great film studio of the time, UFA, which made all the sort of great classic movies of the 20s that you probably know came out of that studio, and it was owned by Hugenberg. And he used his papers really to push a right-wing agenda. He didn't have quite the media reach of all the liberal papers sort of put together, but it was significant. Now, as for the Nazis, one of the things that probably a lot of you will know about the Nazis is that they were very sophisticated and forward-looking in their use of media. A lot of this had to do with the guy who I think is possibly the most interesting of the major Nazis, and that's Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda director. I say he was the most interesting because he was far and away the smartest. Goebbels was a really interesting guy with a PhD in literature. He had studied with Jewish professors. He had a lot of interest in modern art and modern literature. Was an absolute political fanatic, absolute Nazi fanatic, absolute burning anti-Semite. But oddly, he's the only example I know of a political fanatic who could do a certain thing. He could sort of step outside of his fanaticism mentally, and he could kind of contemplate what Nazism looked like to someone who didn't support it. And then he could think about how to pitch that person, basically, like what you could say to convince that person to follow it. And so he was very good at his job, which was basically advertising for the Nazis. And partly under his influence, the Nazis were pioneers in using film as a political campaign tool. They were pioneers in using radio for political campaigns. They had, from the standpoint of graphic arts, they had spectacularly great election posters. I mean, just visually, the election posters are really striking. And there was a certain symbolism in the last three, I think, election campaigns that were more or less free. Hitler campaigned using an airplane, which was, again, virtually unknown in those days. But he was able to fly from town to town, which meant he could cover a lot of ground. But it also created an image that these people are really, these are high-tech, modern, forward-looking, youthful, dynamic. And they advertised his campaign by playing as Hitler over Germany, which of course has a double meaning. So all of this put together created a sort of powerful media counter image to the basic position of the mainstream press, which was pretty hostile to the Nazis.
Gentleman right here, the microphone's coming to you.
First of all, thank you for a wonderful discussion.
Thank you.
My question deals with Woodrow Wilson after World War I. He proposed, I think, to Clemenceau, and I think Winston Churchill agreed too, that they wanted to break Germany up into 3 separate countries, Bavaria, Prussia, and Germany, with 3 separate governments, so they could never again do what they did in World War I. Is that true? And to what degree did that go forward?
There was some talk of it. The French were actually particularly excited about doing at least some of that for fairly obvious reasons. The French were quite interested, for instance, in at least hiving off the Rhineland and having that as a separate zone, which would have the dual advantage of making Germany a bit smaller, but also having the region that bordered them be not part of the greater Germany. But all of those ideas were pretty much non-starters from the beginning, and they never really went anywhere at the peace conference. There really wasn't any constituency for reversing the process of German unification that had happened under Bismarck in the 1870s, 1860s and 1870s. And I think that was probably wise. I mean, I think if that had been done, if it could have been done at all, even physically, it would, however angry Germans were about the peace treaty, and most of them were about the Treaty of Versailles, this would have been epic and off the charts in terms of the anger it would have created. So it probably would have made the situation in the 20s even worse. So I don't think that was ever a really viable possibility.
You have time for one more question. The microphone will be coming to you, sir, right there.
2 very brief comments first, and then a meaty question. Is there any significance to you wearing de Gaulle's Cross of Lorraine on your tie?
Yes.
Okay. Secondly, I think when General Paulus surrendered at Stalingrad, he said he would not take orders from a corporal, not a private. But he may have been wrong. And lastly, the real question is there were so many extremely intrusive or terrible conditions imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles didn't that contribute to the hyperinflation and many other things that really destroyed the social fabric to a considerable degree?
Okay, so small point first. Hitler's rank is actually one of these like little funny things. You have a lot of you have probably read. You usually read that he was a corporal. Okay, what he was in German was a Gefreiter, and that doesn't equate quite right into any of our ranks. But I actually consulted a couple of German military historians about this to see if I could get this right, and they said it's definitely not corporal. It's close to private first class in American terms. So it's, it wasn't a high rank anyway you slice it. On your question about the treaty, okay, so I think the conventional view in the writing of history up until fairly recently was pretty much as you've articulated it, that the treaty was harsh and it explains a lot about the rise of Hitler and the anger in Germany after World War I. There's kind of a revisionist take on this, which I find persuasive, which is actually the treaty wasn't so bad in the big scheme of things. This is in a lot of the recent really good writing, like Margaret Macmillan on the Peace Conference has sort of made this point. It was actually of the 5 or 6, I can never quite keep all this straight in my head, but of the 5 or 6 treaties all named for chateaus around Paris that ended World War I, the Treaty of Versailles is the only one like anyone's actually heard of, but there were a bunch of other ones for all of Germany's allies. The Treaty of Versailles was actually the mildest of all of them. And if you think about what the Allies could have done to Germany, actually going back to the other question about possibly splitting it up, it didn't inflict particularly harsh terms. It left Germany pretty much intact. It took a little, nip and tuck here and there, East and West Prussia and Silesia and Eupen Malmedy to Belgium and a little bit to Denmark, but Alsace-Lorraine, of course, went back to France. But the loss of territory was not too great. The reparations that's sort of notorious, Germany ended up paying relatively little of what the original idea was that the Germans would pay. And the reparations payments were constantly being renegotiated in Germany's favor during the 1920s. The military terms were, I think, reasonable and to be expected. If you've just kind of narrowly won a war against a powerful opponent, you would have a strong incentive to keep that opponent's military forces relatively low. And Germany's forces were, under the treaty, to be kept relatively low, but not outrageously given what it needed. They left them with an army of 100,000 men, which they calculated was enough to keep internal order and not enough to attack anybody. Seems actually rather reasonable to me, I think. You know, the politically important thing is, I think, most Germans thought the treaty was an outrage and an affront. They particularly didn't like the infamous war guilt clause by which Germany had to assume guilt for the outbreak of the war, World War I. And they didn't like the reparation payments that flowed from that, although, as I've said, they ended up not being that high. So it was sort of the symbolism of that really angered a lot of Germans. But the last point I'll just make on that too is that if you want to understand why Hitler came to power, and my book is basically focused on the question of how do we understand how this guy and his party came to power, the treaty doesn't really get you there simply because virtually all Germans hated the treaty. This was across the political spectrum, from the communists to the Nazis and everybody in between. They all denounced the treaty as a slave treaty, you know, yada, yada, yada. So it didn't give the Nazis any particular advantage. Like, their opposition to the treaty did not, in this case, differentiate themselves or them from their democratic or left-wing opponents. So it was kind of a wash politically in terms of partisan battle within the Weimar Republic.
That is it. And thank you so much for coming. And
Thank you very
please
much.
thank Ben Hett.
Charlie.